Hello, everybody, and welcome to Claire's first kind of podcast. This is brand new. This is a new format for us, so bear with us while we try and figure this out. I've got Nick Willenbrock with me. We both work for Claire, so I'll pass over to Nick to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Ellie. Yeah, this is definitely new for us all, and we've just spent a great percentage of the morning trying to work out how we're going to do this, so bear with us. The most important thing, though, is to mention that actually the purpose of this first podcast is to fit in with our ReCon Soil project, which is funded by Interreg and partners us with project partners both on this side of the channel and in northern France. So this podcast really is fitting in with our brief under that project for improving communication and awareness of soils reuse and soils manufacture. So that's kind of why we're here, and we hope actually that these podcasts may go beyond just today, and we can start speaking to lots of interesting people on the fascinating subject of soil.
Yes, that'd be good.
Fascinating people and soil.
Yeah.
We've got our latest recruit to the team, Jonathan Atkinson.
Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah. Do you want to give a brief introduction about who you are and your history?
Sure. Yeah. So many of you may know that I've worked for the Environment Agency since it was born back in the mid-90s. Prior to that, I was working in Kent County Council Waste Regulation Authority. So my background is very much waste regulation and particularly contaminated land stuff. I saw the beginning of the contaminated land regulations and how those were implemented and initially well funded as we got going, and then how much of that land contamination work has moved into the development sector, which is obviously where Claire has got its key background as sort of best practice within that sort of remediation strategy network. And obviously when we introduced DoW CoP, and I'll perhaps talk a little bit more about its history a bit later on, but Claire was set up partly to sort of administrate the nuts and bolts of DoW CoP, and they've done an excellent job of that ever since. And
so it's a good opportunity because you were there like when it was all originally discussed and those original arguments of waste, kind of non-waste, were had, and that kind of history lesson. And we've been talking recently about potentially doing a kind of history bulletin, haven't we? Reminding ourselves around all those kind of discussions. Like you were quite involved at that time, weren't you?
Yes, I mean, and I think very much that's part of the problem is that people forget why it came into being. Just sort of touching on it now, the original brownfield strategy in the 90s was that 60% of new housing had to be built on brownfield sites. So there was a really strong driver there for A, to remediate legacy contamination, but B, to find effective ways of doing that sustainably. And one of those sustainable measures was to move away from digging up all the old contamination and dumping it in a landfill site and bringing in a whole load of virgin material to enable the development. It was very much about what are the mechanisms for reuse. And the first project that I was involved with that engendered that sort of approach was actually Channel Tunnel Rail Link. Now, some people call it High Speed 1, where the London Waste Regulation Authority and Kent Waste Regulation Authority worked together with our legal advisors at the time. Jonathan Houghton was the guy who sort of helped us look at the legality of things. And there was proposals made to work within the framework of could you reuse material on site? Did it meet the Waste Framework Directive exclusion for clean naturally occurring materials within site of origin? Could you expand that envelope a little bit within the context of that whole contracted piece of work? And what was the most sensible way forward? And then what were materials that you could not reuse and therefore had to go off for recovery or treatment or disposal elsewhere? And it was that sort of framework that was built upon in the original Environment Agency document, definition of waste on greenfield and greenfield sites, which sat with that sustainable development mechanism. It was always recognised that you had this sort of slightly grey area of, the big question, is it a waste or is it not a waste? Are you discarding it? Are you not discarding it? And it was very helpful, I think, to have that sort of framework and the associated regulatory position statement that said if you're going to do it this way, under best practice, you can reuse materials on site, even if you need to treat them first to make them suitable. And DoW CoP was then passed over to the industry steering group to pick that up and take it forward in what we know is version 1 of DoW CoP as we know it now, where Claire was sort of administered. And originally, the Department of Environment and EA and indeed the predecessor to DLUC paid for Claire to do that work.
Yep.
It wasn't a sort of like, oh, Claire started it up and took it forward. It was we paid you to do that administration when we were and I'm on the EA and the government departments.
I kind of sometimes I think that some of those government departments have missed a trick in taking some kind of credit for that work. Like they kind of forgot that history lesson and have missed the fact that certainly the Environment Agency, and the funding from English partnerships and things like that.
Yeah,
like that's what got it all going. And it's just a bit of a shame over the years. That's been
I think that has been a problem. I mean, you've had a few old fogies like me who've been around since the beginning, but you've also got lots of new blood that's come into departments and Environment Agency, and I think you're right. They've kind of forgotten that history lesson to some extent. And it's seen as a sort of it's a Claire initiative, and it's like, well, no, it wasn't. It was a government EA initiative working with NRW when NRW was formed to enable this sustainable development of these legacy sites and bring forward brownfield sites to deal with the really significant contamination legacy that many of them have, but also to sort of get away from this dig and dump, which was a Waste Framework Directive requirement.
So before I joined Claire, I worked as a contaminated land consultant, and that's what I was just thinking. You forget what a game changer it was. So back when I was young and on site, it was literally just dig and dump, and even some of the forms of just kind of now standard treatment were that again was the history of Claire, was to try and demonstrate these technologies and actually how viable they were. But that was kind of the option. I mean, literally everything just got put on wagons and fired off to site. That was treatment,
or indeed just reused on site without proper assessment. And I mean, one of the reasons that I think DoW CoP gained ground was that we recognised that construction sites all up and down the country had done various activities for years that were not best practice, and this was trying to bring in a framework alongside your sort of best practice on different techniques and innovative techniques that were coming to the fore, like in situ treatments and stuff. But this was a framework alongside that to enable people to redevelop sites and reuse material, but do it in a best practice manner, not just go, oh, we'll bury that under the car park, or we'll that's going to be 3 meters down, so it doesn't really matter what it is, hazardous or otherwise. We'll just chuck it in the bottom of the gas holder and fill it up with something else on top, and then put a concrete slab over it. I mean, we've still got plenty of sites around that were developed in the 60s that are like that, where they just reused material, but it wasn't suitable. So DoW CoP was very much about saying, well, we understand the envelope for this of reuse, but it must be done in accordance with best practice. You can't just sort of chuck it in the ground.
So one of the things that I have noticed coming into this industry is that there's kind of like a realization that soil is almost a living organism, or we should be treating it like a living organism. But kind of the fact that you talk about previously, it was just kind of reused without consideration. Like it kind of shows that at that point it was seen as like a thing, like an item, a material, rather than what it is, which is it has a function.
I think that's true. I mean, I think we are increasingly looking at soil as a very valuable resource that we need to manage appropriately. And certainly in the sort of greenfield sector, you're looking at that living soil. I mean, on a lot of brownfield sites, you didn't have living soil. You had materials that have been deposited as made ground over the years to create the original development platforms that were put there maybe after the war or even before that. And some of those materials are certainly not viable as soil resource, but that doesn't mean to say you can't separate out certain bits of material and make a living soil by sort of incorporating relevant things in landscaping areas and so on. But I think one of the issues that came up with DoW CoP in looking at that was actually very much assessing the geotechnical as well as the chemical aspects. And I certainly know sites that happened in the early 90s where lots of materials were trucked in to create development platforms to raise sites above flood level, for instance. And the materials weren't geotechnically suitable. And then halfway through the project, there would be slippage or instability, and they had to go back and do a lot more expensive work to make that site geotechnically suitable. So that's why DoW CoP, it's important that suitability is looked at in all the range of factors that we have to look at. And going forward, we do need to look at that sort of live issue of soils as well, in terms of if you've got good topsoil on the site, you don't destroy it. You use it appropriately on site or store it for an interim period, or you use it somewhere else on another site, so that we are protecting and keeping that resource rather than disposing of it and damaging it.
We were wondering as well about your own kind of personal entry into the industry. Like, I definitely stumbled in. Like, I remember literally being at university on the last day, getting my results, and then thinking, now what am I going to do? Like, for me, I stumbled into the research doctorate with Jacobs and then took a job. But so maybe land quality picked me rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
But Ellie, I don't know, how did you end up kind of in the waste land quality world?
I've taken such a weird route. So I have my degree was in zoology, taking interest in like animals and the environment, conservation, ecology, that kind of thing. And then I took a gap from working, came back into like a pest control management scheme, and then moved from that into waste, trying to kind of get back more to the environmental aspects of what I enjoy. And then from there, took the waste knowledge that I had at a local authority and moved over to Clare, and sort of have gone like such a bizarre route really, and ended up here. And soil is a brand new thing for me when I started, and came in from waste, so learning then about how soil has been treated as a waste in many cases. So now I'm kind of rejuvenating my interest in like learning and the environment and bringing up this stuff. So bizarre.
I feel to some extent I'm coming back full circle, because I did environmental sciences as a degree at Plymouth when it was a polytechnic, and I chose Plymouth because it was a very dynamic hands-on source. That's
just flag, of course, University of Plymouth are one of our project partners on ReCon Soil.
Yeah. So, but I was there when it was a polytechnic, and I'd chosen Plymouth Poly because it had a very active, dynamic learning environment. The only other course that was doing any other place doing environmental sciences at that time was UEA, but we were quite closely linked on the courses. So our external examiners were all from UEA, for instance. And I did environmental science there, and then I went on to what was then the National College of Agricultural Engineering at Silsoe, which is now part of Cranfield, to do soil and water engineering with a view to going to work abroad. And indeed, I did do that. I went straight from Silsoe to work in the Philippines as VSO, did voluntary service overseas for a while. Then I came back and I struggled to get a job because back in that time, we didn't have very many environmental regulations. We didn't even have environmental impact assessment regulations until 1989.
So when was this, like,
so, without
giving away your age?
Yeah, no, well, that was, I suppose that was sort of around about, when was it, mid-70s? Sorry, mid-80s. So I went back to work as a technician in the geography department at Plymouth Polytechnic for a year or so. And then through my contacts with my old lecturer on ecological resource management, I went across to Papua New Guinea and worked with him in the forestry Department of Forestry in Papua New Guinea at the university there. Then I did a bit of travelling around Australia, and I came back, and I ended up in Kent because my then girlfriend had got a first teaching job in Kent. So that's how I ended up there. And I worked for the geotechnical group in Kent County Council, doing site investigations, boreholes, soakways, all sorts of stuff. So I learned the geology of Kent on the ground, doing boreholes all over Kent, actually, which I found was a really useful, interesting experience because it teaches you, what drillers have to do. It teaches you the practicality of getting onto site and access and all that sort of stuff. And then I moved across to the waste disposal group and started looking at closed landfills and putting gas monitoring boreholes in old closed landfills that have been developed and finding some very interesting stories about how many houses had methane underneath them, and a bit scary for a while. Kept thinking LOSCO is going to happen all over the place, but it doesn't. The envelope for real problems is quite a small envelope if you look at the sort of triangle of explosivity. But it was an interesting learning experience, and it taught me a lot about risk assessment and risk communication more particularly, and how people sort of understand risk from a very narrow perspective quite often. It's more about perceived risk than actual risk in many cases. And I think that follows through into sort of soil assessment.
Because of that connection with being answerable to the public and the community, talking with the public, in particular.
Yeah. And you've got to frame things to the public in a different way to you would if you're talking to a sort of technical specialist or something. So and public speaking and public engagement in those sorts of, should we say, high energy meetings sometimes can be quite difficult. But I learned a lot about risk communication in a very short period of time. And some valuable experience there. And then, I moved into the Environment Agency and carried on working in the groundwater contaminated land groups. And DoW CoP was sort of a natural progression, as I say, from what we did with CTRL initially. So I've kind of always been involved with it, even in the sort of early days of version 1 being written by those that wrote it, and working, within the EA. And obviously the regulatory position statement currently sits in the Groundwater Protection Principles document. We hope that under version 3 we will get a new revised regulatory position statement which clarifies some of the ambiguities that have arisen over the years, particularly with version 2. And I've been involved with DoW CoP with yourself, delivering training and writing the early drafts of version 3. So, very familiar with it, but it's really great now to be engaged with the wider professional community as soils are recognised as a resource. And I think our key problem, which hopefully the DEFRA SHAPE Soil Health Action Plan will begin to address, is that soils haven't been actually sort of mentioned specifically within the Environment Act. So you've got air, land and water, but you haven't got soils. But I think that is being recognised, and certainly the Environment Improvement Plan recognised that substantially. In the change in the way it discussed soils, both within the rural settings, but also in these urban settings as well.
There's another little link, listening to what you're talking about, back to Plymouth University, actually, which is to Professor Ian Stewart, who was the previous director of the SCI down there, and in many ways helped us get the ReCon Soil project together. But he's, and I'm going to apologise because I'm not going to reflect it very accurately, but he's definitely done a lot of work over the years in communication of geoscience, and a lot of the findings of the research they've done there when they've looked at public perception of science, geoscience in particular, is, and our industry, I'm certain, falls into this category. Like, it's the experts and the technically trained who are the outliers. If you look at people's kind of confidence and understanding, faith almost in science of any issue, like, the scientists get it, the engineers get it, and everybody else largely is over here, and we tend to communicate in the scientific way, like, here's a graph, here's numbers, I'll tell you about it, and that doesn't work. That's demonstrably doesn't work. And so your experience of interacting with the public more is something that's really valuable, and whether that's Claire or the industry's got to come to terms with that, because I think most of us recognise we're way off the mark at the moment.
I think we are, but I think there has been a sea change over the last 5 years. I mean, you could talk about David Attenborough and Blue Planet and how that's engaged the public and actually sort of made them realise how important climate change and the issues around climate change and carbon and so on and so forth has been. But you've got others, I mean, like the agricultural setting for soils, where we've degraded soils for so long because of the farming subsidy process, is now recognised. I mean, Countryfile this weekend was just talking a lot about flooding, but it was also talking about soils and the new elms and all those issues around soil as a resource, soil as a living entity. And so many people on the rewilding and regenerative agriculture have made huge strides over the last 4 or 5 years. There's always been the pioneers who've been doing it for 20 odd years, like the NEP estate. But others have suddenly engaged with this because the price of fertilizers went up, because the cost of energy is going up. People are beginning to look at, and on Countryfile they said last night, we need to move back to a more traditional farming system of mixed farming and rotational farming to keep and help our soils get back into a good state. And that's a phenomenal change in perception within the farming community compared to what it was 10, 15 years ago. It's taking us back to an approach that was sustainable, an approach that was protective of the soil resource, but also protective of local food securities and all those sort of things for farming, the farming economy.
And it does link us to ReCon Soil, doesn't it? Because we've got in Work Package 2, guys down at Plymouth and AFL are doing the plant stress tests on growing in manufactured soils, and also Jan and the guys over in Cathay have done a lot again on monitoring the health of it's courgettes, isn't it? Yeah. But and the demonstration plot down at Halligan, which the guys at Egan Project set up, was some form of Swiss chard, I think. So if you wanted to go and see some manufactured soil actually in the wide world, there is a small plot, test plot down at the Lost Gardens of Heligan. So the link between our world, construction, development, whatever, and agriculture, soil clearly links it, doesn't it? And
absolutely,
that knowledge from either camp is starting to percolate across, which is really good.
And I think, ReCon Soil's talked about biochar as well as one of the sort of potential parts of the recipe. And again, biochar is coming back again. We dealt with it. I had projects and workshops on biochar about 10 years ago. We were looking then at seaweed. And there are certainly uses to enable us to use some of our organic waste to lock in carbon into soils and productive soils for many, many years. And that, again, carbon zero and all that sort of discussion around that. Soils is a vital part of that. I mean, I think you've said in the past, soils is one of the biggest carbon sinks we have. But if you mistreat it, it's actually an emitter of carbon. If you deal with it properly, and land, I'm not just talking about the rural setting. If you deal with it properly in the development setting, you can preserve that ability for soil to act as a carbon sink and a carbon store, and enhance it by doing things like soil manufacturing that ReCon have looked at the recipes for. So that actually landscaping soils could be a mechanism for projects to lock carbon in. And it's not just all about biodiversity net gain above ground in fauna. It is about what you do with the soils. Can you lock in carbon by actually enhancing the biodiversity of your soils, coming back to them as a living organism, as you mentioned earlier on, Ellie.
And I think, as we were talking earlier about communicating the concepts of soil to like the wider public and kind of the issues that we face, these kind of topics of carbon capture and flooding, they're really easy concepts that we can communicate with the public about, and explaining how different components of the soil can affect these, so retaining moisture or retaining carbon.
Absolutely. And I mean, you mentioned flooding there and retaining moisture, and I think in all the sort of flood assessments and works that have been done for a long time, soil was forgotten, and yet the amount of soil that we erode off our rural landscapes every year is phenomenal. It's amazing how much soil is lost through different agricultural practices, but also not looking at the soil as a moisture retention opportunity. And I think now we're looking back at catchment management of flooding rather than hard defences in towns and so on. That element of what soil offers is actually being looked at again and afresh as well. And having good, healthy soil that's biodiverse with animals living in it and earthworms moving around in it and so on and so forth is as important for flood management as building new hedgerows or stone walls or whatever other opportunities there are, like contour planning.
The thing that connects you two guys is you've both been regulators. Like I've worked at Clares for 16 years. And Nicola and Robert done even more than me, but that pales into nothing because you were 34 years a regulator.
Yeah.
Like I wonder, both of you, like how when you then. Well, I guess Clare sits in the middle, so you haven't fully crossed. But how does that? What's your opinion? What's your perception of the industry, and its performance and things like that?
Well, I think in the past, I can remember back to version 1, when talking to people like Peter Witherington and others about that, it's like, this is happening on every construction site in the country. What we want to do is actually improve it. We don't want to just stop it, because you can't do that. Construction sites are construction sites, development is development. There's a huge growth driver there. But you do want to make sure that people follow good practice. And again, Clare reviewing and helping DEFRA rewrite the code of practice for soils on construction sites has taken that original document, which was a very useful document in its time, to sort of raise the issues. But now we're talking much more about soil as a resource rather than just a material you have to deal with during the construction process. And I think those sorts of things are critical. But in terms of regulation, I mean, I think the Environment Agency regulatory position statement last year was very good. It was issued in April, I think. And it was talking about you want to deal with things that are high risk. You want to deal with things in partnership with industry. You want to deal with things in a way that's appropriate, that looks at the setting and the context, not just, this is what it says on a bit of paper. You've got to have this box ticked, etc. It's about looking at the real environment and dealing with the real environment as it is, and how you're applying your growth strategy or development strategy to that. And I suppose the clue was in the original name for Clare, wasn't it? Contaminated land assessment in real applications in real environments. Yeah. It's like, you're looking at a real environment. What do you need to apply in terms of techniques and approaches to make sure that you deal with the contamination aspects but also, deal with the growth opportunities, and deal with the resource opportunities, deal with all sorts of things. The RAP aggregates protocol was about secondary materials being good quality, not just crushed with lots of bits of asbestos in it. And I think regulation has to sort of be there, because if you don't have regulations, then you're always going to have the cowboys who shortcut everybody else and ruin the whole piece for everybody, as we've had with everything. Your oceans or whatever environment you look at, it's always been the people who cut corners that have caused the most damage. But if you follow good practice, or you follow best practice, then there are huge opportunities out there for us to do. And I think regulators work generally best if they work with industry to sort of take that forward. And I think that's reflected in the regulatory position statement that was regulatory position was issued by the Environment Agency last year. As an overall framework. And I remember my boss in waste regulation in Kent saying, we have to prosecute somebody somewhere along the line. We've actually not done a good job as a regulator. We should have been there as part of compliance and enforcement, offering advice much earlier on in the piece. But of course, that relies on resources for regulators. And I think that's, I don't know whether you'd agree, Ellie, from a local authority point of view, but to my mind, regulation is falling down at the moment because of the lack of on-site resources. And I've been to plenty of sites where, whether you were dealing with a landfill operator or whether you were dealing with a developer doing remediation activities, was that they wanted to engage with regulators more. And the resources within regulation has meant that that's not been able to happen quite so well now as it did perhaps 15 years ago. So that's one of the frustrations that regulators have, I think.
Yeah, from my perspective, as you were saying about resources, well, there are so many things that we could have done in my local authority that we just didn't have the means to be doing at the same time. And you kind of end up chasing your tail, dealing with the bigger problems. So big waste issues rather than prevention. But that is not the goal. That is not the desire. And I think people, if you start seeing the problem that you have as like, well, this is my problem, and like taking action on it instead of leaving it to fall to someone else, that tends to be what happens. Is you don't deal with your issue, pass it on, and someone else has to pick that up and try and rectify it.
And I think that's the key issue, is this whole sort of debate around climate change, global warming, and people like David Attenborough and Greta and others have sort of said, look, actually, it's all our responsibility. You can't just leave it to somebody else to sort it out, whether it's waste or whether it's how we manage soils in our gardens or in our development industry or within the farming sector. It's about, we've all got to play our part. And that's the whole point of an ecosystem, isn't it? It works if all the bits work together. If you damage one bit of an ecosystem, then actually the other bits of it. And I think people are now beginning to recognise is that humans are part of the ecosystem. The damage that we've done is not going to just affect nature or the oceans or our air. It's going to affect us. And, one of the things that has really always driven me as an environmental scientist is I want a world where my children and grandchildren can actually live a reasonable life. And we're hugely in danger of actually jeopardising that at the moment.
And I think that's important. Like, nobody, or I certainly don't know anybody that would want to go out and actively cause harm to the environment. This just tends to be like a side effect of the behaviours that we're doing. But I think, as you said earlier, about regulators stepping in and sort of being a more of a guidance and assistance on that, when you kind of work in step with people, understand that the barriers that they're hitting and can work to overcome them together, then you can find an end goal that is an end solution that is more appropriate for everybody and doesn't do that damage.
So that's, I think, again, back to the kind of history, especially with the DoW CoP, that's an element that's largely been forgotten again over the years, that this was always a joint endeavour. I think it was about industry and the regulator working together for a common purpose, for a common process that both parties could support. And that's something we've been talking about with the new version. That's got to be the jewel in the crown that we maintain. It's not about necessarily just what the industry want or just what the regulator. It's Claire's role has always been about trying to get these groups together
and it's all
get
the
a workable solution.
It's all the regulators. I think too often the focus is, it's the EA. Claire is working in partnership up and down the country with NRW, with the EA, with English Heritage, with others, English Nature, DEFRA. It's about that partnership of regulators. It's not just about the sort of focus of one and the failings or misdemeanors of some in the industry and others, It is about partnership. And
in my time at Claire and before, inevitably, we've been certainly with Claire, like fortunate to be involved in a whole heap of really interesting projects. We're in quite a privileged position because we're usually invited in to see behind the scenes of a number of projects, likes of HS2 at the moment, but there's been a number before. The Olympics springs to mind.
Yeah.
We did some really interesting work a good number of years ago with Network Rail. My question was going to be, though, so 34 years, like, there must be some standout projects, like, either good or bad, I guess. So maybe we'll focus on the good ones, perhaps.
Yeah, no, well, I mean, certainly CTRL, I think the approach that we developed there in conjunction between Kent Waste Regulation and London Waste Regulation Authority
because that was a huge amount of soil reused on that. I can't remember the original kind of volumes, but it's like
I can't give you the volumes, but that was the reason the question was asked. It's like we've got to get rid of all this material, and then 8 miles up the road we've got to import a load of material to create an embankment. It's like that doesn't make sense, and it was like trying to develop that framework to enable that sustainable approach. But as you mentioned, the Olympic site again, we learned a lot of lessons from that in terms of but also regulations have developed. I mean, when we alongside DoW CoP, mobile treatment permits were introduced because it was recognised that to reuse some material you did need to treat some of it first. And the approach of a site permit didn't work well in the development sector. So mobile treatment permits were introduced for remediation activities, which I think was a huge step forward.
That was the link back to the kind of the permanent indelible mark left on the site, wasn't it? And then the need for the mobile element to scrub
come in and get out. Yeah. I mean, I think that was the key thing, is that investors particularly and mortgage companies and so on saw the blight of a waste license on a site as being a really significant issue, and that's why a lot of developers didn't want to play ball with the site-specific permit, and that's why a lot of development sites that had opportunities and were in the right places were left for many years as derelict sites, and then you have a derelict site, you get the whole range of social interactions and vandalism and dereliction issues that come up around those sites. Whereas DoW CoP and mobile treatment permits were a very serious move towards addressing some of those opportunities rather than seeing them as areas that just been left to become derelict. And you think of a number of gasworks sites and old rail sidings and whatever have been dealt with over the years because DoW CoP existed, because mobile treatment permits existed. And that's where regulation and development have come together really well. The issues we're getting now come back to, again, resources, where the resource for permitting things in a timely manner, permits were meant to be issued within 3 months. It's taking 12 months or more in some cases now. I know the EA is struggling really hard to try and address those issues, but it comes back to resourcing. And, there's a huge amount of frustration, I know, both within industry, but also within regulators. We want to do this better, but our resources are constraining us to do it better. So hopefully we can resolve those issues as across government now with the new Environment Improvement Plan. There is this onus across all government departments to actually recognise where the resources need to be, and maybe some of that will be readdressed in the future.
Quite looking forward to getting more involved in specific projects over the next few years, because one of the things you're helping us with at the moment is kickstarting site visits and site audits. So a lot of the team, I think, slowly ordering lots of high-vis jackets. The good news for everybody is that Claire team members should be out and about a lot more. That's going to be interesting as well, because you see the good, the bad, and the ugly in many ways. We will see the bad sites. We'll hopefully see a lot of good sites as well.
And I hope people will come forward and offer those opportunities for site visits. Initially, they will be site visits and about cooling to see what's happening and what is good practice on sites that have a high profile. And how people are doing things, and then, as you say, in due course, perhaps developing some kind of an auditing process that industry can take forward alongside us, and that works with the regulators in doing their own sort of audit type work and inspection work. But again, helping so that they can focus on the higher risk activities alongside HMRC and others within government who need to sort of look at the poor performers and the illegal performers. But give us and the development industry an opportunity to sort of go, well, heck, let's make sure we're doing it according to good practice and best practice, not just doing it. And I think those site visits will help because, again, you go on site, and my involvement with the planning process over the years has too often been, you can get all the planning documents lined up and right, but if those don't translate through to practice on the ground, they're just documents on a shelf. And whether that's doing a decent remediation strategy and making sure you're collecting the information to close it out, the verification report, or whether it's actually people not understanding what they should be trying to do. All of those things can come together. But site visits generally help that process to sort of work the documentation into the site practice.
Yeah.
And I think that's why we've been made welcome on some of the High Speed 2 sites that we've been visiting in recent month. And we'll continue to do so through this year, and indeed on other projects and with other partners in industry, to sort of go, let's come and have a look. And, you know, we'll see things with a fresh pair of eyes, and maybe we can say, well, hang on a minute, that doesn't look quite right, or actually that's really good practice, and maybe you could write us a case study that we could put on the Claire website. So, you know, there's all of these opportunities.
Love a DoW CoP case study. Yeah.
All of these opportunities coming forward.
I think it also comes back to what you're talking about, like working in lockstep with industry. I think being there and being given the opportunity to hear from people on site about what their current problems are, what they're running into, what barriers they're facing, and then taking that opportunity to think, well, how can we as Claire in our position help to address these issues that they're facing and work between.
And I think, you know, that's why the Claire networking events are so important, because it's those conversations that happen where you can sort of come
another
up
part of the
ReCon
Soil project.
Well, absolutely, yes. But it's those opportunities to have, you know, discussions around topics. And I mean, I had a very interesting chat with one of the people from the net that came to the last networking event we held here on the back of the ReCon Soils day, was actually sort of about digital tracking. Now, you know, digital tracking for waste movements is being brought in. We all know that over the next few years. But, you know, we're trying to talk about material under DoW CoP that's a resource, not a waste. So I think, you know, we're talking about best practice. There's no reason whatsoever why people shouldn't be introducing some form of digital tracking to assist in managing their materials tracking and then subsequently their verification plans and reports. Now, you know, there's software out there that people can use relatively simply. I remember the Olympic site did an awful lot on logistical tracking using, I think it was BRE Smart Waste at the time. But there's lots of other systems available, and you know, there are many people. You know, you've got people from France, you've got people from Canada, you've got local consultants developing innovative apps and whatever that will assist us with all of this. And maybe that's the direction of travel for DoW CoP, is that, you know, if you want to follow best practice, you need to deal with some of the, what I call the likeable rogues in the industry, perhaps. You know, make sure that your hauliers are taking things where they're meant to be going. And you can see that on a map. You can see each truck going to deliver where you want it material to go to the relevant receiver site. So it's about all parts of industry working together, you know, not just the waste producers getting through stuff through planning, not just the people who want to maximise and reuse resources in a sensible way. It's everybody, and everybody playing their part. Again, it comes back to that thing again, doesn't it? It's like, I can't hand this problem on to somebody and hope it happens well. We've all got a part to play to make sure it works well, and we take each our own responsibility for ensuring it works well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, so I've been thinking, really, since I've joined Claire and have sort of been taking on more information, I've come to know you as a font of knowledge, and you just always bring insightful comments, talk about your history and things. So I think it's important for us to kind of understand how you keep up to date with information, where you get your knowledge from. If you want to talk us through.
Sure, yeah. And I mean, I suppose one of the best ways of doing that is being part of a professional body. So I've been a member of the Institute of Environmental Sciences ever since I was a student. I joined as a student member, and I became a full member about 5 years later after my experience working in Papua New Guinea with Professor Wigston. And over the years, I've been more and more involved, and I was a council member at IES for over 6 years. I'm still involved with their land quality group and their climate change group. And attached to that, our umbrella chartership body, the Society for Environment, also runs a lot of stuff. And I think both those organisations and many others, including Claire and various other industry players, certainly over lockdown, learned a lot more about doing online stuff, online webinars, discussion panels, forums, conferences, whatever. And that's given a huge opportunity to have a massive library of really good webinars that are online. And you can look on the IES website, you can see the whole list of stuff that's been done. But they help keep me current. And obviously the professional journals that we get through our professional bodies is helpful. But I would just advise people, you know, I mean, Claire offers a wonderful online learning opportunity package for young professionals, particularly coming into the land quality sector. And those have been available for some time, but they've been revamped over the last year or so. And I would recommend those highly to people. So use the resources that are out there. But yes, it is about staying current, but it's about being involved as well. Get involved with your professional organisations, get involved with industry bodies and industry projects and workshops. I've had the pleasure over the years of working with a number of steering groups related to projects that have been run by Clare, by Syria, by government departments, letting contracts for contaminated sediments, for instance, in terms of providing advice and guidance on that. All of these things, PFAS is one of the next things that, is sort of a really interesting area to work in, and one that we certainly need to look at in terms of sustainable reuse of materials, particularly on sites like the redevelopment of old airfields and things, or naval dockyards or whatever it's going to be. And I think it's engagement. It's like, don't just put your head down and do the day job. Keep your eyes open, listen to stuff. There's so much resource out there. Not least, if you haven't looked at the Clare Wall, then go and look at the Clare Wall, look at the Water and Land Library that's there, and delve into some of that stuff. And things are being reviewed and refreshed all the time. I mean, Nick brought a book into the office the other day on soil, and I looked at the forward of that and thought, this is kind of a rewrite of my original Bible on soils that was written by Brady that I bought when I was at Silso. And it is exactly that, and he was one of the leading lights of soil science for many, 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 many years. And it's great to see that forward in that particular book, which is basically a revamp of the book that I've got. So yeah, it's important. And those, there's been a specialist core who've always known soil is vital. But now, hopefully, that message is getting wider, and we can all begin to talk about the resources that soil is part of the ecosystem that we're talking about. And if we want to have biodiversity net gain, if we want to have useful resources and avoid wasting resources, if we want to have food security, we've all got to talk about soils as well as part of the mix.
So you mentioned tracking systems earlier, and I wondered, there's a number of big kind of changes that the industry is facing in terms of the way it works. There's, I'm sure it's McKinsey that ranks construction right down with agriculture as the lowest for adoption of IT or technology. So clearly industry could do better in that kind of front, especially from your regulator perspective, like if you were giving simple tips to soil managers, house builders or things like that, like what other things might you suggest people focus down on? What immediate changes can people start doing?
Well, I'm hoping that the DEFRA Code of Practice on soils for construction sites will offer some real insights into how some of that should be done in accordance with good practice.
And the really big spoiler around that is the timing, isn't it? Like that's doubling down on how much earlier projects really need to start.
Absolutely, and I think as we've done that project, we've recognised that actually, like for years in the land quality industry, we said, look, don't do your site investigation at the last minute to comply with the planning condition. Actually do it while you're doing project design so that you can come up with the most sustainable development layouts. And the same is now of resources, is actually do your soil surveys early on in the process and work out how you're going to maximise using soil or protecting soil on your development site as a resource, rather than, it's material we've got to move out the way or track all over. And then, we've got to put some landscaping soil. Oh gosh, this stuff's no good anymore, so we need to get rid of that and bring some more stuff in. And it's looking at that right through the design stage. And I think you're right. I think the DEFRA document that we've been trying to refresh looks in accordance with the REBA work packages, doesn't it? Trying to link it to the architectural design and the project design and the project plan to ensure that you look at it right from the beginning. Yeah, absolutely.
What have you picked up since your time here? If you were telling the industry what they should do, what do you reckon you would say?
I've kind of come to understand more about like the concept of stockpiling and how managing soils on site like that really impacts. So the compaction, kind of the degradation of the sort of function of the soil from how it's stockpiled. I think that's really interesting, and that seems almost like a relatively simple change, that if you just follow some key principles around stockpiling, that you can maintain a more healthy and functional soil. And I think that's something that's really valuable.
And I think that was really interesting to see what DEFRA put into the environmental improvement plan in terms of that thinking about soil as a resource and whether you can stockpile it on site and reuse it, or whether you need to stockpile it off-site somewhere. And I think they call them soil depots in the environment improvement plan. taking up some of the sort of practices that are done on the continent, where they have, soil treatment centres, as it were, and systems and frameworks where you can't throw material like soil into a landfill site unless it's extremely hazardous material impacted by contamination. You actually have to think about, how do we move it into a resource recovery zone? How do we then use that in further engineering projects or landscaping projects or whatever? And I think there is that shift, and it was brilliant to see the DEF are able to get that into the Environment Improvement Plan, and that's the focus of travel towards 2026, I think was the date.
Yeah, it was, and we've spoken about this a lot. We talk about it in the training. The whatever you call them. I've had conversations with some of the guys at Plymouth's Soil Centre of Excellence. I know Dr. Ian Selby's talked about from Plymouth as well. Geo-resource hubs. There's all these different terms you can use, but a fixed space where you can look after ground forming materials. There's another invented term there, but yeah, a safe space for these materials so they can be looked after and kept in the loop. It's something we've talked about. We've put a lot of work historically into draft ideas in the DoW CoP, and I hope, we hope certainly now that's been properly written into DEFRA's EIP, that there's a real opportunity there, like to develop that concept.
Absolutely.
So that's hopefully something that's going to keep us busy.
And I think it's clearly been recognised in Europe conference with Nicole at the Nicole conference in Athens in November, and the document on soils that came out of that the statement, Athens statement. Clearly, Europe is recognising the value of soils and where those opportunities lie. And producing soil strategies, and it's very encouraging to see DEFRA is sort of looking along those same lines of looking at this stuff as a resource, and actually working out ways where, if legislation or practice has to change, permitting has to change or whatever, to enable that sort of activity. I think is brilliant. I mean, I remember you asked earlier on how I get my knowledge. One of the things I do regularly have been involved with is the Environment Analyst Brownfield Briefing conferences. I'm one of the judges on the awards panel each year, and that's been an enormous amount of learning I get as being a judge, looking at all the different projects that comes through on that what I think is seen as an industry standard highlight. But I can remember talking to Ian Grant from Brownfield Briefing many years ago when I was running one of the workshops that we ran down in University of Greenwich in Chatham on soils treatment and soil management. And saying, my dream in 20 years' time is that we will have soil hospitals, I think was the phrase I used back then, where we don't throw soil into landfill sites. We actually use it and store it and treat it, and then enable us to reuse that as a resource. And I remember him doing an article on what I'd said to him in the next issue of Brownfield Briefing. But from my point of view in the Environment Agency, I go to landfill sites, inert landfill sites, and I see lots of London clay being thrown away into the ground, and then thinking, and our plans for flood defences around Kent the southeast over the next 15 to 20 years are going to need an awful lot of clay. Why are we not storing it where we can then actively use it in flood defences? And that was a question that came up, and we did do some work in the Environment Agency in the southeast to sort of, can we take some of the stuff that's coming out of high speed too that would be useful? And there was some discussions made with our flood defence colleagues at national level on that issue. But the problem has always been the interim storage. Where, how, who's responsible for it? How is it managed? Is it managed as a waste, or is it managed as a resource? And I think these are the things that DEFRA is beginning to sort of recognise and deal with in their proposal for soil depots. And I'm hoping that we will have materials repositories where we can store materials that might not have an immediate use, but actually certainly have an opportunity to be reused in the future. And it's how we frame that as an industry and as legislators and as regulators to enable that, so that we can build the flood defences that we will need as we face sea level rises in critical areas. Recognising we can't do it absolutely everywhere, and there will be some levels of managed retreat to create new habitat, etc., as we saw on Countryfile yesterday. But it's a big, lots of big questions. But I think we need to work together as industry and government and regulators to actually enable sustainable solutions, rather than just sort of saying, oh well, this is what we have at the moment, or this is what we had 10 years ago and we haven't changed. We've all got to change. And I thought the Environment Improvement Plan offers us that opportunity, and I'm sure the SHAPE Soil Health Action Plan that DEFRA is developing will offer more opportunities, hopefully, to see what the direction of travel will be.
Then I have a question. Understanding that soil treatment facilities exist and they operate as businesses, how do you see a distinction between the two? And do you think that soil treatment facilities would end up playing a role in something like that?
I think they potentially do. I mean, we can have soil repositories for clean materials. Alongside those, I don't see any reason why you shouldn't have what they have in Belgium and the Netherlands and elsewhere in the world, where you actually have soil treatment centres that turn contaminated soils into a useful engineering material.
Yeah, or manufacture soils as well.
Or indeed taking different components of some of them waste and manufacturing, like biochar would be one of the things that might be useful in an agricultural setting, for instance, or a landscaping setting. So there are those opportunities. It's how we frame the legislation and the permitting around that, so that we don't stumble over what is the current issue of once it's a waste, it's always a waste, and then it's difficult to get it out of end of waste, which for soils has always been a bit of a problem area. But I think if we look at that creatively, we can see where the opportunities are not to create waste in the first place, not to discard materials, but to store them for reuse. And I'm hoping that the sort of framework that DEFRA develop around the soil depots idea will enable that to be a sensible, sustainable approach, rather than it getting locked down into barriers of waste labelling, which I think is they recognise in that document. They talk about moving soils to be reviewed as resources rather than as waste.
Yeah. So we're moving close to our kind of final straight here. An interesting kind of chat. If we gave you, I should caveat this, like it's not an indication of what's going to happen with the DoW CoP. If we gave you a blank piece of paper, like what immediate changes would you make to the DoW CoP? What do you think is?
Do you want me to be honest here?
Always.
Well, I think we need version 3 because we all recognise that version 2 did have some ambiguities in it, and it did have some grey areas that poor performers have danced through the loopholes and actually created huge difficulties for some of our regulators. We need version 3. We need it to be succinct, but we need it to be in line with what DEFRA have put in the environmental impact plan. We need it to be looking at materials as a sustainable resource rather than just as a waste. We need the regulatory position statement to be clarified around that, or new legislation to actually, mandate what's going to happen, as they do in Europe. You can't throw soils away in Europe. There are some European countries that ban topsoil going to landfill at all completely. So we're not talking about sending it to non-hazardous landfills, which you can't send topsoil to landfills. It's too valuable a resource. So I'd like to see version 3 come forward as quickly as possible, but with the caveat that we need to sort of align it with what's recently been announced. I'd like to see digital tracking coming in to DoW CoP. It is a best practice framework.
I feel there's so many other industries that can track things to the nth degree. There really isn't any reason why construction can't track some wagons of soil around the place.
And people are, and I was having conversations last week with people who are developing, relatively simple mobile phone apps that will enable that to happen. So, and as I say, we've had there's players from Canada and players from elsewhere who are very much developing that sort of software approach. I think you've mentioned before, the whole of industry is sort of getting onto the sort of more, what is it, business implementation using IT, and all of that helps with project planning and all the rest of it. And certainly I think us doing more site visits and working with industry to sort of embed best practice. I think the release of new guidance, Syria is going to produce some new overall overarching soil sort of guidance in the near future. We've got the DEFRA document that we've been working on as Claire, which I think is a huge step forwards. It brings the authoritative soil science behind what is going to be good practice.
Kind of in a slight golden era, aren't we? Because there's the task force group up at Lancaster University is a good document as well.
And I think people should grab that and make toolbox talks out of the key points from that, because that helps. As I say, it's not just setting the framework up here in paperwork on the planning process. It's embedding it into your contractors on site.
Yeah.
And that document I thought was very useful for a quick run through of the key issues that development construction sites face, and you could develop some marvellous toolbox talks.
We like the IEMA guidance for EIA as well. That was really quite an authoritative text as well.
although not all projects would be doing AIA, but it's still the concepts that are in there.
I think you're right.
So there's a whole slew of
We
different
seem
stuff
to be
there.
in that position where suddenly people have woken up to it.
Yeah.
You know, the Society for Environment produced their Soil and Stones report a little while. Martin Ballard and Rob Earle were talking about that on the Brownfield Briefing webinar last week. The 10 principles of soils, that's going to certainly be taken forward. You've got this MP's inquiry on soils at the moment. Yes, this seems to be a time and a place when suddenly soils are being recognised for the value that they offer.
Finally having our moment.
And and it's been a long while.
It does feel that way, because air and water were like the big things everybody really focused on for a very, very long time. And those of us in soil were kind of patiently biding our time, and now we're...
But I think it's, again, I mean, the interesting thing about the Society for Environment Soil and Stones report was that it drew people from across the different sectors to recognise across functions that soil was a valuable resource. And I think, you know, that not the farming industry for so long degraded soils, and now they're really waking up to the issues of food security as much as anything else, flood management and all those sorts of things that are involved with how they manage soils. But you know, the development sector is also working up to the fact that it's costing money to get good soils into gardens and stuff like this. And whichever way you do it, if you don't do it right, you possibly face a waste issue, or you face just gardens that don't work, and then your customers are really annoyed. So I think it's really vital. I mean, my brother moved into a new house 5 years ago, and his garden's been flooded more ever since, because they didn't put down proper soils in the gardens to enable a garden environment to develop. You know, he's had to have his garden redone about 3 times by the developer, and that's a development cost that's totally unnecessary if people had appreciated the value of soils to start with. So it's all good.
How easy was that?
Yeah.
Podcasting. Done.
Yeah, so I guess we should say thank you. So thanks, Nick. Thanks, Jonathan. And thank you to anybody that listened. I'm going to try and make sure that any resources that we want shared are included in the link attached to the YouTube video or however we share this. And we'll also put a link to sign up to our low carbon technology network. So anybody who's interested in events or keeping up to date with information, you can sign up to that. And that's how we share news around ReCon Soil and other projects, other bits of developments information.
And we'd like feedback as well. Like, did you like the podcast? Should we do more podcasts? Who should we go speak to?
Yeah.
We could have suggestions. Feedback and suggestions. Who do we go to next?
Yep. And I think, and again, thank you to Ellie for setting it all up and managing it so well. And I think that's one of the critical things. It shows to me coming into Claire actually that the reason Claire works well is because it's operating as a team. You've got different people with different skills and expertise and what they have to offer, and you're melding that together to create a better whole. And I think, you know, it's the teamwork in this team that has been such a joy to come into and work with over the last 3 months. And I'm looking forward to the next year enormously.
And we didn't tell you to say that either.
Yeah.
No, you didn't at all.
You didn't really.
Great.
Perfect way to end.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.